This is Identity at the Center. If it has anything to do with IAM, this is the go-to podcast. Now your hosts, Jim McDonald and Jeff Stedman.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Oh, not so bad. Yourself?
Doing great. It feels like all the forces in the universe were driving us to have this podcast session with this guest today. You know, last session we had Howard and Jackie from 1414 Ventures. You know, one of the points that I made at the time was that I thought PAM was ripe for disruption. Last night I was listening to a podcast, which is the Cooper and Cole podcast. Very good. I recommend it for anybody. They had a friend of the show on the podcast, Paul Fisher, talking about PAM, really talking about some of these underlying changes that are happening in the PAM space. And, it's changing due to a lot of the changes that I believe are happening within IT, automation of deployment of infrastructure. So infrastructure as code, movement of IT infrastructure out to the cloud, out to applications in the cloud, things like that. And so, we'd done an episode called "Is PAM Dead?" maybe a year ago, right? And it just kind of feels like the situation of like what PAM has to do has changed so much. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an evolving space. We are such identity nerds. You and I were actually texting last night around the idea of, how do we go about sort of assessing and strategizing privileged access management these days? Feels like, the old days of, I got a password vault, so I've got PAM. Well, okay. Guess what? I don't think that's good enough anymore. And I think the world has changed. And now I'm starting to think more about like AI and PAM and, how is that going to affect privileged access or entitlements or whatever it may be. So I think it's like anything else. It will evolve. There will be disruptions to the status quo. I think right now the disruption du jour is something AI related. Because I feel like DevOps and sort of like containers, it was kind of like, okay, yeah, we knew about those 5 years ago, 6 years ago, and tools and technologies and processes kind of sort of been identified. Now, whether or not you're actually doing it is a totally different story. But I feel like at least those use cases, we're aware of them. What's next?
Well, I think what CISOs and what information security or IT departments want to get their arms around is they want to centralize the management of those services. And so you talked about DevOps and you talked about cloud, and the engineers who were making those things happen were going out and procuring solutions to solve those particular situations. And the other thing is that the old, privileged access management platforms are at some level, they're trying to keep up with all this change that's happening. And there's a lot of new entrants into the market. I've been, you and I have been going back and forth on, this privileged access management strategy and, what are the capabilities? How do we assess a program and whether or not it's keeping up? And I think, kind of at a summary level, I think there are a set of kind of proven tenets that, they were true 5 years ago, they were true 10 years ago. PAM has to be run as a program. You've got to get buy-in. People have to know what their roles and responsibilities are. You have to have a good paper trail. You have to strive toward least privilege. But then there's all these new trends, cloud infrastructure. Well, I've been saying KEEM forever. In one of our recent episodes, called it KEEM. I got a nice little funny text from one of our listeners, Paul Mazzara, saying, "Jim, it's Kim. Call it Kim." I know he was one of he might have been the person at Gartner who came up with that term. Anyway, he corrected me, so I'll call it Kim. So we got the KIM, the DevOps CI/CD pipeline. I mean, all these new technologies that you need to have you need to get your arms around. And how do you do that? And, what is your maturity around that today? And where does it need to be?
Yeah, I like the concept of dynamic privileging, right? It's just in time. I know we're going to get into that with our guest here in a minute, but I like that idea. I think it's difficult to execute in the real world sometimes because you may not have the technology investment or the process or people investment to actually make it real. But I think that's where things are going, especially if you think about it from a machine perspective. And we're talking about workloads that are instantaneous. They might live only a few milliseconds, but that might be enough to do real damage if you don't have good control over it. And if those, processes, those permissions get hijacked for any reason, it'd be very difficult to recover from. So I think that's where I'm most interested in is sort of like this dynamic, just in time, zero standing privilege, whatever the right terminology is for it. I think that's next, realistically speaking, for organizations, because I think it does take time for organizations to catch up. It's like, okay, here's where the industry is going, and 2 years later, based on budget, political, organizational cycles, whatever you want to call it, it usually takes some time, right, to move some of these things along. Smaller organization, maybe they move quicker, maybe they don't because they don't have as much funding. A bigger organization maybe has more funding, but they're like a freight train. It takes a little bit to slow down or change directions. So I think this is kind of where things are going next, because I think, and Jim, feel free to disagree with me, but I think everyone gets password vaulting. I think most people understand the need or the concept for some sort of session management or session recording or session monitoring. I think that's probably where most organizations are now. That's like either their current or next step that they're on. The next step past that, I feel like, is, okay, how do we get a better handle on the actual entitlements themselves and making sure that those are adequately managed and maybe even linked up with other systems, not necessarily privilege access, but this is maybe where identity governance comes into play, linking the two systems together and having, getting more value from kind of both sides of things.
I agree with you. No, you're not crazy. It's amazing how far we've come, though. I mean, I remember, building a strategy for an organization, someone mentioning that the admin passwords are in a spreadsheet and they're on a shared drive, but only the admins can get to the shared drive.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, that's safe then. We're good. That's called a compensating control, right?
I'm happy to copy that into a thumb drive and see you later.
Yeah, do you need me to email that to you? Yeah, so, but where they will be talking a lot about this, Jeff, which is the Identiverse. Yeah, where would that be? The Identiverse conference in Las Vegas next week.
Yeah, so time is running out. I think this is the last week. I think it's probably realistic for people to expect to show up at Identiverse, but hopefully we'll see people there. You and I are going to be there. We're doing a sort of a live, live recording in front of a studio audience, I guess so I put it. It's not a live broadcast, but we'll have a spot there Tuesday night, 7 p.m., just outside the expo hall. The Identiverse team has been kind enough to set us up with some spots that we could do some recordings there. But hopefully we'll see you there. So you can join the digital identity community at the Aria Resort and Casino in Las Vegas, May 30th to June 2nd. It's the must-attend annual event that brings together over 2,500 security professionals for 4 days of world-class learning, engagement, and entertainment. As an Identity at the Center listener, you get 20% off your Identiverse 2023 tickets using the code IDV23-ICEN20. You can use that at identiverse.com. We'll have a link in our show notes, so it makes it easy. You don't have to remember it. Just click on the link. It'll pre-populate it for you, make it super easy. And we hope to see people there. But time is definitely running out. That's probably the last time that I will read that. And we definitely want to thank Identiverse for partnering up with us to hook our listeners up with a little bit of a discount on their attendance.
Absolutely. I can't wait. I was going back with one of our favorite people. I'm not even going to say who.
We have so many.
She works for an analyst firm. They haven't been on the show in the past. And she said, well, if I just happen to be walking by during the 7:00 hour and you happen to grab me and stick me on the live stage with you guys, there's probably not a whole lot I can do to stop you. Wink, wink.
Yeah. I kind of mentioned the same thought. I think I know who we're talking about. That, hey, if an ambient mic happens to pick up a voice, what are you going to do? You're at a conference, right? We'll see what happens, but I'm definitely looking forward to seeing new and old friends there. And I think we've got a pretty good lineup coming up for that, at least for that 7:00 show. You've done a good job of putting together people for that.
Well, thanks. I mean, I feel like I remember feeling like I had to convince people to come on the show in the early days of the show, and rightfully so. I mean, we were just not very good in those early days. Who the heck are you? Right?
What are you doing?
Who the heck are you? And then I remember Eve Mailer agreed to come on the show. And then it was like, okay, well, everybody would email, by the way, Eve Meller's been on the show. Then it was Jackson Shaw, and then Ian Glazer. And it was like, my emails became, hi, we've had guests such as Ian Glazer and Eve and Jackson, and felt. Now we're at the point, I think, with as many listeners as we have and such an awesome fan base, people know of the show, and I don't really even need to convince them whether or not they should be on the show. They've already made up their mind.
Yeah, it only took 4 years to get here. It's a slow climb, but hey, we're a 2-man op. What are you going to do?
Yeah.
Speaking of esteemed guests, why don't we get to ours for today? We talked about privileged access management up front. We're going to get into that in a little more detail here. We referenced going, is PAM dead around this time last year? That was episode 142. But why don't we welcome to the show Ron Nissim. He's the co-founder and CEO at Entitle. Welcome to the show, Ron.
Thank you very much. I'm super happy and honored to be here.
Yeah, so thanks for taking the time for us. And one of the things that we like to do when we have a new person on the show is to really kind of understand their origin story when it comes to identity and access management. So why don't you tell us, how did you get into IAM? Is it something that you chose or did it choose you?
It's funny because I started my journey in cybersecurity in the Army, and we saw all this like next gen stuff, right? And we finished our service, and we saw what companies we were entrepreneurs. Knew we wanted to start a company, and we saw what people were starting companies around was all this like next gen AI stuff, right? But we knew what companies were getting compromised for was like same old boring crap. Sorry for the French, but people and companies, their biggest risk continued to be just boring old permissions. And most recently, Uber and Okta's hacks just emphasized that, like, end up getting compromised for some boring privileged access. And we knew there was something that needed to be done there. And we were really drawn towards the challenge of creating something new in an old industry. And I think kind of felt like we kept trying to go off of different offshoots in different areas, but we kept getting drawn back to access management, mainly by security professionals that we were talking to.
So now you're with an organization called Entitle. For people who aren't familiar with Entitle, what do you guys do? What's the problem you're solving? Give us sort of like the 30 to 60 second elevator pitch.
Cool. So what Entitle does is automates cloud access management across the organization. So whether that's in the self-service requests, enabling employees to request access to what they need, through creating policies that enforce automatically across your cloud infrastructure and SaaS applications, be that everything from databases all the way through Salesforce. And the idea is to create a simple to deploy, simple to maintain cloud access management solution that, where conservative companies took forever to implement and see value from, we're very quick to deploy and roll out throughout the organization.
Hey, Ron, one thing we like to do on the show is not move too fast and lose people. So I wanted to start with a question of how do you define PAM? Before you answer that, the follow-up is going to be, hey, we recorded a show last year, I referenced it earlier, called Is PAM Dead? So after you tell us what PAM is, I'd like you to go into, is it dead?
Good question. Well, to answer if it's dead, you have to define what PAM is. And you look at what historically privileged access management solutions provided. I think it was 3 tiers of value. The first was just the authentication to conservative on-prem old systems. So you had an old system, it had a username, password. You wanted to enable logging in with your SSO. You wrapped that in a vault and created some sort of jump service. So that was kind of generally what that actually solved for, was just the authentication of an old username password system to a new SSO. At the time it was Kerberos on Active Directory, and now it's SAML and Okta. The second part was creating a more intricate authorization layer where you could, someone writes the sudo command and you can create a policy of who can write what commands inside the application. And these more, again, conservative systems didn't often have intricate authorization policies. And so by being the middleman, you could create these policies and by doing so. And then the third was session recording. And session recording was kind of a byproduct of just, again, being the middleman. I knew exactly what people were doing. And I think the reason that PAM is definitely changing, I don't know if it's dead, but the definition of PAM is very much changing, is that when you look at that first part, the authentication methods, those are changing because the solutions themselves, the applications are adopting a more up-to-date method of authentication. So whether it's natively by companies integrating logging in with SSO, or with other companies wrapping it, like what Teleport does for SSH keys, as an example. And then the session recording, the third part, is being solved natively in the applications, right? If you take the audit logs from the applications themselves, I can see exactly who's doing what. I don't need a middleman be telling me what's going on and who's doing what inside the application. And so kind of the only part that's left there is authorization, right? Who can do what inside the application. And I think historically, authorization is more of a IGA problem. It's the actual administration of who gets access to what than the actual provisioning. And so just-in-time access has kind of become, I think, ephemeral access to sensitive resources, while historically being called PAM has become kind of a sub-use case of general permission management.
Yeah, talk to us, if you would, about that just-in-time access or JIT access. Talk about what it means, like some of the details. So are we talking about there's an account there that, I as an administrator can kind of access that account when I need it just in time and then not have the access? Or are we talking about the account actually being provisioned on the fly?
It's a good question. I think that very much depends on the application. Generally, the underlying idea behind just-in-time access is it's making sure that people don't have access to things that they need when they don't need it. And especially when it comes to privileged accounts, the sensitive resources, those are things that you want to be really, really, really meticulous on who's doing what inside those applications. Generally, you want to control who has access to what across your whole organization, but you want to start off with the sensitive aspects naturally. And when looking at those sensitive aspects, it's really hard to govern and control and create policies. And RBAC, historically, it's really hard to know exactly who needs access to what at any given time. And so by creating a self-service model, you're enabling people to elevate their privileges when they need it, but not have the privileges when they don't. And by doing so, you get a lot of other byproducts for that as well. You get auditability in retrospect, exactly who elevated what. And back to your original question of, is it creating the user? Is it elevating privileges? That very much depends technologically. There are a lot of applications. If I want to elevate someone to an admin in Okta, I'm probably not provisioning the user. I'm just changing his role inside of Okta. If I want to create privileges inside of a database, I might actually have to create the connection string in order to enable that. And so very much depends on the application.
So I want to turn this discussion around about, if I have invested in PAM over the years and I've got one of the well-known privileged access management platforms, should I take that platform and take on some of these new use cases in the cloud? Are those tools getting there, or are they there in terms of being able to do those things? It's interesting. I mentioned that podcast with Paul Fisher. He talked about the leadership compass that he wrote for privileged access management, and they break down their compass. They break down the vendors by leaders, challengers, and followers. And he said that a lot of buyers, they go right to the leaders, right? They don't even want to consider somebody who wasn't good enough to make it into the leader field. But he said what's more interesting are the challengers and even the followers, which is the newest entrants who are taking on very specific use cases. I want to get your thoughts on that, but I also want to know, is there a reason, if you're invested in a platform, is it really sensible to think that that platform can take care of all my needs, or does it need to be supplemented? Or how do you want people to look at that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I might want to tie this back into general entrepreneurship, right? The challenges of starting a company in a well-defined space means that you just have to be still much better. You can't be a little better. You just have to blow things out of the water. And I think that a lot of companies, when they look at their cloud infrastructure and their cloud approach, you always have two options, right? You either migrate your existing infrastructure and existing team into working on that cloud environment, or you start from scratch. And I think that what we've learned in a lot of different cycles of innovation is that it's really hard to adapt an existing product and infrastructure, both as a vendor, but also as a buyer, right? When you are building up a new part of the company that is going to be relying on new infrastructure, you can't be adapting those current tools into kind of that new world. Now, will people be trying? Absolutely. And I even encourage them to do so, because if you're able to extract that value out of your current platform, you should definitely do it. I think what we're saying is that it's very challenging. It's very challenging to be able to build in a new infrastructure world, use old tools and an old mindset.
I really like how you approach that question from the standpoint of an entrepreneur, because I think as an entrepreneur, you're starting up a business that's going to, not hit the full breadth of the market on day one, right? You have a vision on where the market is heading, whatever, 5 years, 10 years down the road, right?
Absolutely. And that's kind of the thesis that you start off with in a company, because I think our job as entrepreneurs and as vendors generally is to kind of foresee what the needs, or guess, or that's not that we're oracles, but guess what the needs of the market will be 5 years down the line. There's always a dance, right? Providing the needs for the needs of companies today and being able to generate revenue while thinking more forward, 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, what will the needs of these companies be? And I think that in a lot of different industries, I can give a few examples. What you see is companies targeting, you always start with targeting kind of the early adopters, out of the understanding that the larger companies will end up migrating a lot of their old infrastructure into kind of a new approach. And you see that with a lot of different cycles of innovation.
Yeah. And I think what I hear you talking about is not kind of this hybrid cloud that a lot of folks are talking about today. Is almost like, I don't hear you talking about like in the future engineering your product to handle the on-premise data center. So is your theory that the on-premise data center is a dinosaur, is a thing of the past? 10 years from now, they'll barely exist?
I'm gonna say something here, on-prem is dead, and then people are gonna burn me at the stake. But it's a good hook to start off your podcast with. I think that generally, especially a lot of your listeners, it's always a dance between what does reality look like today and what do companies actually use? And a lot of companies still have a lot of on-prem infrastructure. But again, we're thinking about how will the future look like? What will companies be adopting? And I think that there is a very, very wide range, a wide adoption of both SaaS applications and kind of the aversion of developing things internally, and also the adoption of cloud infrastructure, AWS, GCP, Azure, whatever, Oracle, whatever on-prem, whatever cloud infrastructure provider you use. And so generally what we're doing is we're building a cloud management, a permission management platform, around the needs of cloud resources. And one of the things that enables, by the way, is I think the challenges of access management is that every company is a special snowflake. It's so tied into the business values and use cases that it's hard to create a platform that serves a wide range of companies. And the beauty of the adoption of SaaS and infrastructure is that all of a sudden companies are more similar in their technology stack. And that enables companies, vendors, to build a product that's fit for a wider audience and less reliant on professional services and long implementation times and so on and so forth. Definitely a lot of benefits of adopting a cloud infrastructure world.
Yeah. And there might be people sitting out there listening and thinking, Ron is crazy. These data centers aren't going away. Whether or not that's true, right? We're all looking into our own crystal ball based on our experience and trying to figure out, where things are going to be. And, the only way we'll know who's right is to wait until that actually happens, right? But, to turn this into a question, I was listening to Paul talk about it, and he said, well, there's a growing population of companies that intentionally have multiple products that fit under this umbrella PAM. They have and some of this he's probably projecting because they did a survey, and he's analyzing the information coming from the survey. the way I took it was a lot of people have these traditional PAMs, but to solve these use cases like what you're talking about, they'll intentionally have multiple products. Well, in the future, it might be that the most important products are the ones that solve these particular use cases, and the on-prem is the niche. But I think there's also a scenario, what we've seen in access management, right, was, there was this heterogeneous support was the way of computer associates within Integrity and, Oracle or Albix. They had the support for, hey, all these different ways that you might want to do web access management. Then Okta came along and said, well, all we do is SAML support. And you thought, well, how can you win if all you do is SAML support? Well, obviously, it's pretty clear who won now. But now if you look at Okta, a lot of the things that they've done over the last 5 years or so is like put some of that backward compatibility into their product, right? Because they don't want that old application that you haven't upgraded to be the reason why you don't go with Okta, or that you have to choose one of the old legacy players.
Absolutely. And that's always a balancing act. By the way, as a buyer too, like when you are sitting in front of your infrastructure, you're thinking, where do I want to focus my efforts? If 90% of your infrastructure is on-prem and your services are internally developed, then that's going to be your top priority. But if 90% or 80% of your infrastructure is cloud, then that's going to be your top priority. And that's where you're going to want to focus. So it comes down to every company having to assess where their priorities are and then going with the partner that can help them, that is focused and aligned on focus.
So let's get into just a little bit of the minutia here a little bit, because I talked a little bit about just in time from a entitlement perspective and managing those things, and zero setting privilege and ephemeral, right? And all the fancy words that basically say, how do we make sure that the right thing or person has the right access at the right time? And I think the separate part of that question is at only the right time, which I think is the harder part to achieve. I guess, what is your viewpoint on, is that realistic as a goal to achieve today? How can people start to think about privileged access management in terms of not just having the access, but only having it when it's needed, and then taking it away from everything, everyone, as part of their organization?
I'll answer that by taking a step back, if that's okay, and starting about like, how did access management start initially? And kind of the biggest buzzword at the beginning was RBAC, right? Role-based access control, and the idea that you create these clusters of permissions that you assign based off of what the jobs to be done. And I think the challenge of RBAC over time is that you realize that the organization is flexible and evolving. It's a living creature of sorts. And then it's really hard to define set concrete roles of people over time. And then a lot of things have cascaded from there in different options of how to solve for RBAC. And I think that one of the things that have been born out of that necessity is the idea of automating the request process, is creating a process where employees can self-service, elevate access, and change privileges based off of what they need. And the beauty of that is all of a sudden, you don't have to be as rigid in what you define employees get as birthright privileges. I think the reason that companies were focused so much on creating these amazing roles is that they knew that the business implications of an employee not having access to things that they need is really high. If I need access to something, I don't have it, I know I'm going to be going through a 2-week ticket process on ServiceNow. And that sucks, frankly. And so what companies and security teams felt is they needed to overprivilege to make sure that the business was effective. And so I think the whole idea behind self-service is, how do I reduce that barrier? How do I make sure that employees can't get access when they need it, so that I as a security team can feel comfortable removing that access? And that's not to say that RBAC is dead, right? There are set permissions of things that you feel comfortable giving away. But the more sensitive the role is, and the more granular it is in terms of how many people need that access, the more the request process comes in and kicks in. And that's why I think just-in-time access around sensitive resources has become a very strong use case, because it's really hard to define who needs that access. It's really hard to define when they need that access. And so instead of going through the process of researching all these roles and defining and creating this policy that frankly won't be relevant after 6 months, you create a policy around the change management. You make sure no one has that access to begin with, but the change management needs to be flexible and automated so that when people need that access, they can gain it. And now you have a lot of structure and rigidity and auditability as to who's getting that access and where, and being able to adapt the policy over time. So kind of the governance part, which I feel like people have been focused on as kind of the end goal, governance is a byproduct of a good process. If you make the process good, then obviously you're going to be good from a governance perspective.
So it sounds to me like in order for this to be effective in the real world, you really do have to have self-service sort of on lockdown, right? Meaning you've got good processes, you've got good governance over what that looks like, because you don't want to get in the way. And that's typically, right, the main complaint around probably something like this would be, well, it takes too long. It takes 2 weeks to get access. And I think that's sometimes where the knee-jerk reaction comes in and say, okay, well, let's just create that access inside of a role that already exists because Jim might need it as part of his role. And now we start to get into the world of, well, are you least privilege or are you RBAC? Because they are counter, opposing forces sometimes, especially in the world of privileged access management. So, how do you typically see it when you're talking with your customers or other folks in the space? Is how do you make that determination with the client and say, hey, you know what? I understand what you're trying to do, but maybe you should think about it in different terms. Maybe it's not RBAC. Maybe it is policy-based or attribute-based as a basis for things, but it doesn't need to be, the one rule to rule them all sort of approach.
Definitely. I think that at the end of the day, a lot of companies are already getting a lot of access requests because RBAC always fails at the end, right? You always have, and like every law, right? We have our lawmakers creating laws, and then, you have people and thieves bypassing these laws, and then you fix the laws, and it's kind of a vicious cycle. And the same goes with any access management policy. You create a policy around who needs access, and then you still get a ton of tickets in ServiceNow saying, hey, I need access to this or that because I wasn't included in that policy. And so I think that the understanding of the need is there because companies are already feeling the entropy. They're already feeling that need for change management. I think the beauty of creating an automated change management policy is that you'll notice all of a sudden that the amount of requests goes up, doesn't go down, because all of a sudden people feel like they can gain access. And so you feel more comfortable to remove access. And that cycle works well in both directions. The employees feel like they can work and they have access to what they need. And security teams have taken a strong step towards least privilege because they now can take that access away.
Okay, so my last question is, how do I take this and do something in the real world with it? Do I start working on my self-service options to be able to request sort of these, dynamic privileges that are at least privileges that I want to be dynamic? I would assume there needs to be some definition maybe around, well, what do you consider privilege is probably maybe a first step. Do I start with attribute-based access control or policy-based? Like, give me like the first 2 or 3 steps that you'd say, okay, we're going to put in, this just-in-time method for privileged access. What can people listening around the world, so no pressure, take back to their daily lives and say, hey, here's how we can get started?
Well, I'm humbled to be asked that from you because you two are kind of the kings on how to implement access management solutions. But I can give my 2 cents in terms of, generally when I'm a security team and I'm looking to prioritize now my projects on access management, obviously I start with my most sensitive aspects. Those, the crown jewels, that's where my security is most important to me. And then I propagate from there. Maybe that's my SOX regulated resources. Maybe that's my cloud infrastructure. Maybe that's my databases. Maybe that's my Salesforce. Every company, it's a different answer. And that's not something that, we from the side can define. So I think the first step is identifying what are your priorities? Because again, access management, I think access management projects are notorious for failure because they drag out forever and never see success. And so by defining a set priority of resources, you're able to see success around that and then expand your project from there. And so I think, first of all, you start with identifying your priorities in terms of resources and applications, and then create a least privilege and self-service model around that. You want to call it PAM, you want to call it IGA, whatever, it doesn't really matter, but you start with those sensitive resources, create a self-service model or least privilege model around that, and then start adding and expanding across the business units and applications from there. I think self-service and just-in-time access is is a way to see success quickly and simply in an access management world where things drag out. And then it also creates a feedback loop that enables you to create better policies. If you have structured data around who's requesting what, you now can create better policies because you know what people are needing. And now you can create maybe onboarding processes that are better for that same reason.
It's almost like you're conducting like a symphony. You need a bunch of different parts kind of working in concert together. And when it works, it's great. When it doesn't, oh boy, it does not sound good.
I think what I'm hearing from Ron is something that confirms a belief that I've had, which is, getting to least privilege, well, it's hard, right? And it's probably beyond what we can calculate and come up with our human brain. So this is where artificial intelligence can really plug in. You're giving the people this access through these roles. They're only using a microscopic amount. Now we're in the world where we can handle, micro roles, and we can assign micro roles based on the need because the artificial intelligence can think of it, and you just give it the rules. And I'm not saying we're there yet, but that's where I could see artificial intelligence plugging into this because the human brain just can't calculate at that level. Because I think what Ron is saying is like, okay, we use just in time, we can use roles, and we can use Kim, for example, to basically almost like mitigating controls or compensating controls. But that doesn't really answer your question of how we get down to least privilege. To get down to least privilege, you have to get down to defining here's what access is actually needed to perform the function. And I'm not aware of a technology that can really do that right now.
Well, I think that's again one of the benefits of a self-service approach, right? In a self-service world, then employees can be requesting what they need, and sometimes they don't know what they need, and that's kind of on us as the request engine to be able to recommend to them what are their peers requesting. What jobs to be done do they have to do, and how does that tie into their permission? So taking that information, just like you said, both you need both an intricate understanding of the organization, HR rules and on-call systems and training systems and all these sensors around who you are and what you're doing. And then taking all these sensors around the data itself, like what are you accessing? Is this privileged access? Is this PII? What type of information this is? And then being able to tie both sides of those and someone needs to be that glue. Now, that's my cue to say we're that glue, but obviously there are a lot of other companies in this space and approaches to this.
Yeah, what I think you're saying there, Ron, is what I think you're talking about is like what level of AI, quote unquote, air quotes, AI is available in IGA systems today, which is, oh, Jim and Jeff do the same job. Jeff has these roles. Jim, you might enjoy having these roles. Well, that is not least privilege.
Nope.
I'm trying to guess. And I kind of feel like the whole reason we came up with RBAC is because the limitations of the human brain, we can understand roles. And if we can group it and we can get it down to this simple form, then we can actually manage access where we're actually making good decisions. However, we're making good decisions with bad data. The bad data being the groups are just compilations of entitlements that nobody needs all those entitlements.
So I disagree.
Not every one of them.
I disagree with Jim because I think roles were born out of a desire for efficiency, aka laziness. Because I think it's easier to request a role and tell the business to do that rather than make them jump through hoops of submitting. What do you mean I have to submit 8 different tickets to get the 8 different things that my employee needs? That's stupid. Yeah, it's stupid. Totally agree with you. But that might have been the process 15, 20 years ago. And so we came up with the concept, well, how do we make it easier for the business? Let's bundle those things up into a specific request and then push that. Don't make the business jump through that hoop. Kind of figure it out beforehand and go through there. Yes, I think there's some other things probably that go behind it, but I take a slightly different view. Just having come from the operations side, I was like, yeah, let's get roles in there because my customers on the enterprise side would look at me like I was nuts when I'd say, yeah, there's 14 different things that you need to fill out to get your new employee who's starting. I'm really
Well,
sorry, but I need that for audit purposes.
as the techie, maybe I'll try to. I want to add maybe another explanation for why that was born to be, and I think that it has a lot to do with just the protocols and RFCs that were put into place. SAML and all these authentication methods, what they enabled was pushing group attributes into the applications, and so all of a sudden you could create groups in your identity provider that propagated into permissions inside the applications. And it was really hard to do the other way around. It was really hard through these protocols to create groups of resources. That had to be done in, maybe manual tickets in ServiceNow in your ITSM. Maybe it was done through your IGA, but there wasn't a natural and easy way to do that, to create groups of resources. And so what you had to do is you had your HR system pushing into your identity provider. Identity provider already had built-in groups, or almost had built-in groups based off of your HR attributes. And then you had that pushing into the applications. You didn't have anything pushing from the applications back into some sort of policy engine. And I think that may have blended its way towards a very role-centric approach that was focused on HR attributes. It's also, if you don't mind me adding one more thing, is that I think companies have slightly changed in their approach as well. It used to be that companies were very structured and everyone had a goal and job to be done. And as companies have evolved and become more flexible and agile took place, it became much more challenging to define who exactly does what inside the org.
I think that's a pretty good final word on that. So why don't we button it up there? Before we go, we like to end on a lighter note. And I'm thinking about, Ron, you're co-founder of a co-organization, you're in the technology space. The question I've got for us today is, what is a non-technology company that you would like to start? It could be anything in the world, but it has to be as far away from technology as you can get it. What are you thinking today, Ron?
I have a funny one and a semi-real one. Which one do you want?
Let's hear both of them. Let's start with the semi-real one, and then your second one will be the funny one.
Okay, so my semi-real one is that, especially with kind of the whole bank system failing recently, I've started kind of realizing that it feels really weird that the custodians of your money are also the ones that give customer service. So, banks on the one hand have these really smart investors, but they also have branches that help my mom get mortgages. And they're two very different jobs. And it's weird that they're the same person that does both. And I feel like there's some sort of abstraction that needs to be done between the two. That's my semi-real one. Kind of boring. It's like IAM and then finance. Like, come on, it's not that I've done some not a good conversation starter at parties. The other one, which I'm really excited about, I've been trying to find a founder for, is a shared economy. So kind of like the Uber or Airbnb for laundry. So listen, look at this. Like, you don't want to do laundry today. You don't want to iron your shirts, but your neighbor is doing laundry. It's laundry day for him. What does he care to take a few of your underwear and a few of your shirts and throw them into the laundry machine? And so kind of just like
depends what state that stuff is in.
You get it in a bag. It's, you've been like Airbnb did insurance for their apartments. You do insurance for people's underwear and you get a guarantee of a few days, gets back to you clean, becomes a easy revenue stream. And think like, New York kind of bachelor apartment buildings. There has to be that guy that, is still willing to do everyone's laundry for a few bucks at the end of the day.
I like that. I think that's pretty interesting. It's kind of like, what is that? You're renting timeshare within someone's washer and dryer. I mean, it's like a package shows up. It's like, okay, well, here's the dirty package, and then you pick up a new, the clean package or whatever that looks like. I can see that taking off.
Thank you. You're welcome to take it. I want 2%.
I don't know if I have the chops or the washer or dryer space to accommodate it.
I just want to point out the fact that Ron is the first person to talk about dirty underwear on the Identity at the Center podcast. So, hey, we've been going for 214 episodes. I mean, there's a first for everything.
I'm happy that's what I'll be known for.
There you go. Like so many people, I went on vacation to Maui. And when I came back, I said, I'm moving back to Maui. I'm going to live in Maui. And one of the things that is with Maui, obviously, it's an island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It's surrounded by these beaches all the way around the island. And there's actually some of the beaches where it's like a public beach and they allow people to camp. So people will go and set up tents and things like that. But can you imagine you're flying to Maui and trying to bring a week's worth of supplies and a backpack and all of that? You can't really glamp, glamorous camping. It's called glamping. So my idea was move to Maui and set up a business, basically setting people up for camping in one of these public spaces. And it would be nice campsites, or if they had a little bit extra money, it might be like a VW camper, or, I'd have to figure out what the regulations were in terms of the size of the camper that you could do. But that was my idea, was basically to go and, host people or help people get set up so that they can come to Maui, and rather than staying at a resort, staying in your camping setup on the beach, which I think would be uber cool. And by the way, since I brought this whole idea up, right, I said, everybody goes to Maui. Their ideas when they come home, I'm going to move back, and then they never do. And so I worked with a guy, Mike Woodburn, good friend. He listens to the show, friend of the show. And he went to Maui, and I'm like, dude, here's what happens. Everybody goes to Maui. They come back. They say they're going to move there, and then they never do. So he goes to Maui, comes back, says he's going to move there. I'm like, yeah, like I told you, you're step 2. And then he actually did it. So he lives in Maui. He's listening to the show in Maui. So good for him. Good for you, Mike.
Mike's good people, really smart. So good for him. A little bit jealous. It sounds a little bit like Airbnb, but like on the beach or sort of something like that.
Yeah, I figured I probably never have to own sneakers. I just wear flip-flops all the time.
You'd be like a Paul Rudd character, just kind of walking around the beach like, hey, man.
So what's your idea, Jeff?
I came up with the question, and I don't know if I have a really good answer. It's probably something in, I don't really call it technology, but it would be something like a radio show or something that's just like completely like not IEM, obviously. It would be more like a talk show, funny, something like that, where, me and a bunch of friends, probably yourself, get together, right? We just kind of talk about what's going on in the world, and that's pretty much it. And put the opinions out there and not be afraid to, be corrected or to change our opinions. Like, hey, I think this is what I'm thinking. Have someone on, change my mind. All right. Yeah, that makes sense. Maybe my mind changes or maybe it doesn't. But I think just, I think of some of the best memories I have is just kind of sitting around in a room talking with friends, goofing off and just having a good time and being able to be free with each other. Right. And kind of just have a good time with it. So there might be no technology involved. Maybe it's just a microphone hanging from from the ceiling or something like that, catching everybody. But
if you had me on the show, I think we'd wind up getting canceled within 5 episodes.
Yeah, I would expect so. We're pretty opposites when it comes to certain things.
Jeff, some of the most popular podcasts these days are exactly like that.
Yeah, I don't have the time for that. I don't have the time for this one sometimes, but when we make it. So speaking of time, why don't we go ahead and wrap it up for this week so we can let Ron get on his day. Ron, really appreciate you taking the time with us. For folks who are interested in learning more about Entitle, you can visit them on the web, entitle.io. We'll have links in our show notes to their website as well as to Ron's LinkedIn profile, so that way you can connect with him. That's where all the hate mail goes when you hear him say on-prem is dead. That's where we want to send that kind of stuff. Feel free to correct him. I'm sure he'd be happy to engage. And with that, we'll go ahead and leave it. You can visit us on the web. We're at idacpodcast.com. We're on Twitter at idacpodcast. We're on Mastodon at idacpodcast at infosec.exchange. You can always connect with Jim and I on LinkedIn. We're hopefully going to see a whole bunch of friendly faces and new faces at Identiverse here next week. And don't forget to subscribe and rate the show. That's the best way that you can help us here, is get the word out. Share it with a friend. If you hated it, share it with an enemy. Either way, as long as you share it, I'm cool with it. So we'll go ahead and leave it there. Thanks, everyone, for listening, and we'll talk with you all in the next one.
You've been listening to Identity at the Center. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review. And we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit the website at identityatthecenter.com and find us on Twitter at IDAC Podcast. See you next time on Identity at the Center.